There are people who walk away from you, thinking they're choosing freedom. I was one of them. I had everything the world could measure. The power, the rooms full of people who wanted something from me, the calendar booked 3 months in advance. I moved through life like a man who had already figured it out. But here's the thing about figuring things out. Sometimes the most important equation is the one you ignored. I remember the night I made the decision. I told myself it was the right call. I was building something. I didn't have room for softness. For someone who looked at me the way you did, not like a symbol, not like a resource, just like a person. And that scared me more than failure ever did. I've watched empires crumble and rebuilt them from nothing. I've stared down failure so many times it started to feel like a familiar enemy. But the moment you walked out of my life, not because you wanted to, but because I let you, there was a silence that none of my achievements could fill. You don't know what it's like to be surrounded by the world and feel like the most important thing in it just quietly disappeared. I keep replaying that last conversation. The way you looked at me, not angry. Worse. Resigned, like you'd already accepted something I hadn't yet admitted. What does a man do when he realizes the biggest mistake of his life wasn't a business decision? It was a human one. I don't have an answer yet, but I think about it more than I should. There is a version of strength that looks exactly like cowardice. I built it carefully. Over years. A system of thinking that told me the highest form of intelligence was to need nothing. No one. I prided myself on this. On the clean, efficient logic of detachment. On making decisions without the messy interference of emotion. I told myself I was operating at a higher level. That love, dependency, the whole architecture of needing another human, those were inefficiencies. Beautiful ones, maybe. But inefficiencies all the same. And then you were there. Not demanding, not performing, just present in a way that made the whole careful structure I'd built feel suddenly thin. You had this way of seeing through the competence. The reputation. The version of me I showed the world. You didn't seem interested in any of it. What you seemed interested in was the part I kept furthest from view. I didn't know how to handle that. I'd spent years learning to give people what they expected. Power, results, vision. You wanted something I hadn't cataloged, something I wasn't sure I still had access to. Here is what no one tells you about emotional walls. They don't feel like walls from the inside. They feel like clarity. Like discipline. You think you're making a mature decision to keep your focus. You think you're protecting something important. You're not. You're just afraid. But the fear wears such a convincing disguise that you walk through years of your life, mistaking it for wisdom. I chose this. That's the part that stays with me. I didn't lose you to circumstance. I didn't lose you to distance or timing or some collision of impossible forces. I made a choice, repeatedly, across dozens of small moments, to prioritize the version of myself that didn't need you. To let you feel, quietly and consistently, that there wasn't enough room. Most mistakes happen fast. You look up and something is different, and you try to reverse it. This mistake was slow. It happened in whispers, in things I didn't say. In the moments I turned back toward work, when I could have turned toward you. In the way I measured the cost of vulnerability, and always concluded it was more than I was prepared to spend. What does it cost to let someone in? That was the question I never asked, honestly. I assumed the cost was control. Privacy. The clean invulnerability of being known by no one. What it actually cost was you. There's a particular cruelty in intelligence when it's applied to the wrong problems. I could model systems of extraordinary complexity. I could see 10 moves ahead in any competitive landscape. But I could not see, or would not see, that the person sitting across from me, offering something rare and genuine, was not a variable to be managed, but a moment to be met. I managed instead. I measured. I calculated the risk of openness and chose the known quantity of distance. You don't think of it as letting go, in the moment. You think of it as holding together. Keeping yourself intact. Staying focused. But there comes a night, it always comes, when the focus reveals its true cost. When you sit in a room that has everything a successful life is supposed to contain. And you feel the specific shape of what isn't there. Not loneliness, in the general sense. More precise than that. The absence of one particular person. The specific quality of silence that only exists because a specific voice is no longer in it. I've walked away from a lot of things I thought I could afford to lose. I've never been wrong the way I was wrong about that. People talk about regret like it arrives fully formed, a sudden clarity, a dramatic moment of realization. That's not how it works. It builds slowly, in the accumulated weight of ordinary evenings. In the moment you reach for your phone and have no one to call who would understand. In the conversation you keep having with yourself that sounds, more and more, like a conversation you should be having with her. I walk away from things I don't understand. It's a pattern. A reflex. I mistake not understanding something for not needing it. I didn't understand what you offered, the fluency of it. The way you could hold both the complexity and the simplicity of a person at the same time without needing to resolve the contradiction. I left because I was afraid of what it would mean to stay. I'm only beginning to understand what it means that I went. There is a particular quality to silence that success cannot buy its way out of. I know this because I've tried. The trophies, the deals closed, the teams that move mountains at your direction, all of it generates a kind of noise. A beautiful, productive noise that fills the days and gives the nights a sense of earned rest. For years I told myself this was enough. More than enough. It was, by any measurable standard, an extraordinary life. But there's a sound that disappears when someone specific leaves your world. Not silence in the absence of sound. Silence in the presence of the wrong sounds. The hum of a well-functioning life that somehow gets louder in its wrongness the more successful everything becomes. I remember a night, one of many, but this one stays with me, when I should have felt the satisfaction of a man who had done what he set out to do. The work was good. The progress was real. By any external measure, things were going exactly as planned. And I sat in the middle of it and felt something that the plan had no column for. I kept thinking about the way you used to end a day. Not dramatically. You never needed drama. Just a kind of winding down that made the whole arc of a day feel complete. Like it had happened for a reason. Like there was a person at the end of it who made the meaning feel real rather than constructed. I told myself I didn't need that. That meaning was self-generated. That I was the kind of person who derived purpose from work, from progress, from the forward motion of building things that mattered. That's true. It's also incomplete. Here is something no achievement will teach you. The difference between a life that is successful and a life that is full. Success is something you build. Fullness is something you find, or it finds you, in the presence of the right person at the right moment. And it requires a willingness to receive it that isn't a skill. It's a choice. I was not making that choice. I was building. Always building. And if the building kept me from having to sit still long enough to feel the shape of what I'd let go, that was a function of the building too, even if I didn't name it that way. The night I'm thinking of, I kept working past the point where the work was giving anything back. Not because it needed me. Because I needed it to need me. Because the alternative was to sit in the silence and feel it clearly. The silence of a life that has everything except the one specific thing that would make the everything feel like it was for something. You can't build your way out of that. I tried with extraordinary dedication. The projects got larger, the scope widened. The ambition expanded in direct proportion to what I was trying not to feel. It doesn't work. The silence keeps its own counsel. It waits. It is entirely patient. And eventually, in an unguarded moment, in the gap between one task and the next, in the accidental quiet of a night that catches you without armor, it speaks. Not in words. In something more uncomfortable than words. In the specific, anatomically precise understanding of what you don't have that you used to have, and why. Have you ever been lonely in a room full of everything you worked for? Not lonely in the way people use the word loosely, wishing for company, wanting conversation. I mean the other kind. The kind that only exists in the presence of a very specific absence. That knows exactly what it's missing, and refuses the comfort of substitutes. That's the silence I learned to live in. Not nobly, not with any grace, just with the daily repetition of pretending it wasn't there, until the pretending required so much energy that it became its own kind of exhaustion. I built an empire and forgot to build a home inside it. Not the architecture. Not the space. The thing that makes a space a home. The specific human warmth of one person who knows you beyond what you're useful for. I didn't understand then that this was a loss with a name. I thought it was just the price of focus. The cost of vision. The reasonable sacrifice of a man who was building something that mattered. It mattered. But so did you. And I treated you like a variable in the equation of my life, rather than the reason the equation had ever felt worth solving. Most people in my world see me in terms of what I can do. I don't say that with pride. I say it as a statement of environment. The ecosystem I inhabit is transactional at its foundation. Not in a cynical way, but in a functional one. Everyone has something they want from the meeting. Everyone is oriented toward the output. You learn to operate in that world by understanding that what you are, in most rooms, is your usefulness. You didn't do that. I remember noticing it before I understood what I was noticing. The way your attention was calibrated differently. Not toward what I could produce or solve or enable, Not toward the version of me that made decisions. Toward something quieter. More interior. You asked me questions that had no strategic value. About what I thought about, not the projects, not the problems, but the actual texture of my thinking. What it felt like to be inside my own mind. Whether I ever felt afraid of it. I didn't know how to answer. I deflected, probably. I redirected towards something I was more comfortable discussing. The work, the framework, the external expression of whatever you were actually asking about. You didn't push. That was the thing. You just held the space and let me move through it however I needed to. Without judgment, without the subtle pressure I was used to feeling from people who needed me to perform competence at all times. And I felt something I'm still not entirely sure how to name. I think it was the specific vertigo of being seen. Not understood in the way that colleagues understand you, tracking your patterns, modeling your decisions, predicting your preferences. Seen differently than that. The way you're seen when someone is looking at you and not at what you represent. When they're interested in the person rather than the phenomenon. I found it destabilizing in a way I couldn't account for. I know how to be powerful. I know the geometry of that role, how to carry it, how to project it, how to use it. I've had decades of practice. It's not performance anymore, or if it is, the performance has become indistinguishable from the reality. But being seen beyond the power, being looked at with that particular quality of attention that implies, I know there's a person in there, and I'm interested in that person. I had no established protocol for that. So I did what I do with things I don't have a protocol for. I moved away from it. Not dramatically, not all at once, just incrementally, quietly, in the direction of more manageable territory. I created distance, professionally justified, temporally reasonable, entirely understandable distance that was, beneath the justification, just fear. This is the uncomfortable truth I've been circling. The most real thing that happened to me in years was a person who looked at me without agenda, and I treated their attention like a threat. Why? Because real attention from the right person requires real presence in return. And real presence means exposure. And exposure, for a man who has built an entire identity around control and competence, feels like the closest thing to danger there is. No one talks about this, about the particular terror of gentleness, of being with someone whose care is so uncomplicated and genuine that it reveals, by contrast, how defended you've become, how long you've been operating behind glass. I ran from the clearest mirror I'd ever encountered, not because I didn't see myself in it, because I did, and the person looking back was not the powerful, composed figure I'd spent so many years constructing. It was someone older, quieter, more uncertain than anyone in my professional life was permitted to know. She didn't need me to be anything other than that. And I, who navigate complexity daily, who make decisions that move billions, could not find the nerve to stay in the room with the simplest thing I'd ever been offered. Is that strength? Sitting with me now, I can barely call it by its real name. You deserved presence from someone who could give it fully. I hope you found that. I hope the space I left got filled by someone who understood, better than I did, what it meant that you were offering it. And I hope, though I have no right to hope this, that somewhere in the accounting of it, you know it wasn't about you. It was about the part of me that still, after everything, couldn't believe it was real. I've replayed the conversation more times than I should admit. Not compulsively, not in a way I couldn't control, but the way you return to something that doesn't resolve, that sits just outside the boundary of understanding, requiring periodic revisitation in the hope that something will finally click into place. It hasn't clicked, not in the way I want. Not in the clean, mechanical way that most problems eventually resolve when you apply sufficient thought. Because this wasn't a problem, it was a person. And the rules are different. I remember the quality of her silence in that moment more than the words. There's something specific about the silence of someone who has already made peace with a thing you're only beginning to confront. It has a patience to it. A kind of completed sorrow. She wasn't fighting anymore. That was what I saw. When someone argues, when someone is angry, there is still possibility in that. Anger means they care. Means the wound is fresh and the outcome still uncertain. Means you could, theoretically, say the right thing, or do the right thing, and change the trajectory. But she was past that. She had arrived, somewhere through the months I'd spent being subtly absent, at a place of tired acceptance. Not cold, not hateful, just done. And I watched it, and I understood it, and I said nothing that mattered. I have made decisions under enormous pressure. I have stood in rooms where everything depended on the right call, and made it, clearly, without hesitation. I've trusted my judgment in places where the data was incomplete, and the stakes were existential. In that moment, with her, I froze. Not because I didn't know what I felt, I think I knew, in the way you know things you haven't said out loud yet, the knowledge that lives below the threshold of articulation, in the body rather than the mind. I knew I didn't want her to go. I knew that the version of my life she would exit would be qualitatively different from the one she had been part of, not in the measurable dimensions, not in the output or the achievements, but in some interior dimension I had no clean vocabulary for. I knew all of this, and I let the moment pass. Not in one decisive failure, but in the slow, almost graceful collapse of a man who can move empires and cannot move toward a single person. She turned to leave, and I found the only sentence I could manage, something neutral, something that left the door open in theory while slamming it in every way that mattered. She heard the slam. I know she did. The way she paused at the threshold, not looking back, just stilling for a moment, that pause contained everything. The understanding that this was the answer she'd been waiting for me to give, even as I was pretending it wasn't an answer at all. The door closed quietly. That was the worst part. Not a slam. Not a dramatic exit. Just a door, closing at its normal speed, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. As though the most important person in the architecture of my private life had just walked out with the same casual finality as any other departing guest. I stood there longer than made sense, waiting, I think, for the moment to announce itself properly. For some signal that would confirm this was as significant as it felt. For the universe to insert a pause that matched the internal event. It didn't. The room was exactly the same. The objects in it were unchanged. The light through the window held the same quality it had held a moment before. Only I was different. Only something had quietly shifted in the interior landscape in a way that I couldn't see yet, but could feel in the new specific quality of the silence. Have you ever watched someone leave knowing you had the power to stop them, and said nothing anyway? Not because you didn't want to, but because some part of you, the defended part, the controlled part, the part that had never fully trusted that you deserved what was being offered, decided, in that final second, to let it happen. I think about that person, the version of me that stood there and chose silence with a complicated feeling. I understand him. I am him. I also wish, with a clarity that came too late, that I had been someone else that day. I don't know if I would choose differently. That's the question that stopped being rhetorical. I've spent time, more than I'm proud of, constructing the narrative where I would. Where, with the full clarity of hindsight, I would return to that room, to that moment, to the threshold where she paused. And I would say the thing I knew was true. And she would stay. And the story would have a different shape. I've run that version many times. It's clean. It's satisfying in the way that hypotheticals always are, uncomplicated by the actual texture of who I was in that moment, by the genuine density of fear and habit and self-protection that governed the decision. The honest version is harder. The honest version asks, not whether I know better now, but whether I was capable of better then. Whether the person standing in that room had the equipment, not the intelligence, not the awareness, but the actual emotional capacity, to make a different choice. I'm not sure he did. And that is a more uncomfortable truth than the mistake itself. Because it means that the question isn't simply, what would I do differently? The question is, who would I have to be to do it differently? And do I have the courage to become that person now, even without the guarantee that it changes anything? There is a kind of grief that arrives when you realize a mistake was not an anomaly, when you trace the error back to something structural, to a pattern, to a way of being in the world that produced this outcome not despite its logic, but because of it. I'm made of edges, hard ones, the kind that are useful in 1,000 professional contexts and quietly devastating in the intimate ones. I optimized for years. For efficiency, for certainty, for the clean satisfaction of problems solved and targets succeeded. The human heart is not a problem. It's a climate. You don't solve a climate. You learn to live inside it, to read it, to move with it rather than against it. You learn that what it needs from you is not competence but presence. Not the right answer but the willingness to stay in the question. I kept trying to solve it, and she kept patiently offering me the alternative. And eventually, because human patience has a horizon even when it runs longer than most, the offer closed. What do you do when you finally understand the language of something after the conversation has ended? I've been finding that out. It's a specific education. The work continues, always the work. The days are full, and the ambitions are real, and the momentum of a built life carries you forward, whether or not you've finished processing the cost of building it. That part doesn't pause for grief. But there are moments, gaps in the momentum, a particular quality of afternoon light, or a song with the wrong emotional signature, or a conversation that almost but doesn't quite have the specific frequency that one particular voice carried. In those moments I don't idealize it. I try not to. Idealization is just another form of avoidance, transforming a real person into a symbol you can keep at a comfortable emotional distance. What I do instead is sit with the reality of it. The specific, irreducible reality of having been offered something rare, and having looked directly at it and chosen, for reasons that made sense at the time and make less with every passing month, to let it pass. I don't know if I'm capable of what she needed. I hope I'm becoming someone who is, not for her. That chapter is closed in the way only real chapters close, fully, without ambiguity, in the permanent past tense. For whoever comes next. For the version of this that happens again if it does, in a future I haven't arrived at yet. More than that, for myself. Because a man who cannot stay present with genuine love is not, whatever else he accomplishes, fully alive. And I've been half alive in that particular way for longer than I want to acknowledge. The question isn't whether I would choose differently. The question is whether I'm doing the necessary work to be the kind of person who could. I don't have a clean answer. I'm working on deserving one.